Igor de Rachewiltz, Италийн Ром хотод төрсэн Монголын баг хятадын түүх хэл бичгийн ухаанаар мэргэжсэн. 1961 онд 13 сар зуун дахь хятад Монголын соёлын хэрэглээ хэвээр Австралийн үндэсний сургуулийн доктор, профессор, Монгол хятадын түүх хэл бичгийн ухааны сэдвээр 17 ном 80 гаруй өгүүлбэр бичсэн. Монгол улсын албан газар болон хүрсэн. Монголын нууц товчоог англи хэл рүү анх удаа хөрвүүлсэн. Австралийн Камбера хотод ажиллаж амьдарч байна.
Good evening. Today on De facto, we have a guest, Dr. Igor de Rachewiltz, Australian National University, College of Asia and the Pacific. Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the show, and I would like to get your knowledge to Mongolians, what you have been doing with that famous book translation, etc. Please, how you have started to learn or know about Mongolia.
Yes, well, that is a rather long story, but we have to make it very short because of time. And it all started when I was a boy, interested in foreign languages and foreign people, and the history of countries which were little known. This is mainly because I am partly Russian, and so we spoke different languages at home, and this stimulated my interest.
You were born in Italy?
I was born in Rome.
In Rome.
My father was Italian, my mother was largely Russian, and I was brought up with Italian, Russian, and French at home. So that was already quite unusual, but it stimulated my interest in exotica. And the result was that when I was 8 or 9, I became interested in strange alphabets and scripts. The first one was Greek, a beautiful script. And then a few years later, I discovered Chinese and Japanese, and I fell in love with Chinese script. And then it was only in 1947, when I was 18, then suddenly I came across a book that changed my life. This was a book about Genghis Khan, and was written by an Englishman with a Russian name, Michael Pravdin. And it's a very interesting story about how this young boy became the virtual founder of one of the greatest empires, and how he really came from an extremely humble background in northern Mongolia, virtually in Siberia. He was illiterate, and in a matter of 2 or 3 generations, this family of Genghis Khan owned half the world. Now, this was almost miraculous to me. I couldn't explain it. So I decided to go into history and trying to find out more about that. But the thing that really made my interest focus on Mongolia was not only Temujin and Genghis Khan, but it was the script. Because in this book, which I have here, I found a sample of the Mongolian old script. And this is the text in Uyghur Jin, in the Uyghur script of the great seal of the Khan Guyuk, who was the second emperor after Genghis Khan. And I looked at it and fell in love with this script. And I decided that while I was still studying Chinese, I wanted also to learn Mongolian. But how can you learn Mongolian in Rome in 1947? Plenty of books on Chinese and Japanese, but nothing, virtually nothing about Mongolian. So somebody said, why don't you get the Bible in Mongolian? Then you have the Bible in Italian, and then you know the Mongolian alphabet because you got it from the encyclopedia, And then you can read and sort of little by little learn words by comparing the Mongolian with the Italian Bible.
Wow.
So I said, where do I get a Mongolian Bible? I said, there is a Roman branch of the British and Foreign Bible Society. And so I went to that shop, and they produced a little book, which is in fact this very book, which I got from them later. And then they looked, and they found that there was, in fact, a Mongolian Bible in the literary language. So I immediately ordered it. I ordered it, and after 3 months, I had the Gospels in literary Mongolian.
In our script.
In the old scripts.
Uh-huh.
There was no actual translation in Khalkha, Cyrillic, but only in it. It had been done, this translation, in 1847, and they still had one copy in the shop. After 100 years, there was still a copy.
There was did you get it?
I bought the last copy,
I see.
and I was the happiest man in Rome when
Okay.
I came home with this big volume.
Now, where is that book?
I have it at home.
Okay, here or in
Yes, I have it
Australia?
here. I
Great.
have it here.
Okay.
Yes.
So you started to compare.
I started comparing the Mongol text
Uh-huh.
with the Italian
Of Bible.
version of the Bible, and transcribing each word, because I could, I knew the alphabet and I could transcribe, and then trying to make sense. It was, of course, very difficult, and a lot of it was guesswork.
How long it took? Time?
Oh, it took me about, for instance, maybe about 1 month to go through one chapter very slowly. But then eventually I got some publications from Russia, from a Soviet bookshop in Rome. And then I found a small French dictionary of Mongolian, and then a grammar. And so gradually I built up my knowledge. And I decided that because I was doing Chinese and I had discovered Mongolian, that I would combine the two and find out the relationship between the Mongols in China, because I had in the meantime learned, of course, that there was a Mongolian dynasty in China, the Yuan dynasty, and that in fact the main emperor of the dynasty was Kublai Khan, and that this emperor was the emperor during the reign of which Marco Polo, a countryman of mine, had gone to Mongolia, to China, which was part of Mongolia. So everything was fitting very well.
So Marco Polo went to Harhorin or Beijing?
No, he went to Beijing and to Chengdu, which was the summer residence of Kublai Khan, and also he traveled extensively in China over a period of 20 years. But he actually never made Karakorum, because at that time there was strife in Mongolia within the family of the descendants of Genghis Khan. And so also Kublai Khan did not go to Karakorum. He stayed in China.
I see. When you have decided to work on Mongolian secret story, and how?
Yes, when after reading the book by Pravdin, I discovered that most of the information that Pravdin obtained to write his story of Temujin, who became Genghis Khan, all that information came from Russian sources. The ultimate source of which was the secret history of the Mongols. And so I tried to find out
Where
how
was
I
that?
could get hold of the primary
Source,
source,
uh-huh.
which was the secret history of the Mongols.
Mhm.
And I discovered that there was a German translation by a scholar called Heinisch that had been published in 41, and in the same year, a Soviet scholar
Mhm.
called Kozin
Mhm.
had published a translation of the secret history in Moscow.
Uh-huh.
So I was unable to get the translation by Kozin because of the political situation, but I got hold of the German translation
Okay.
of Professor Heinisch.
Uh-huh.
And this was the
Then?
beginning
Okay.
of my interest.
Then how you went? I mean, the original source you were feeling the most earliest one or most original one when you get this first Mongol.
That was when I went to Hamburg in 1950. And I spent one winter, and in the Chinese seminar of the university in Hamburg, they had the Chinese text, which contained the secret of the secret history of the Mongols in Mongolian, but not in Mongolian script, but transcribed into Chinese characters.
Mm-hmm.
So here I had the Chinese transcription, the Chinese word-by-word translation, and then on top of that also a abridged translation into colloquial Chinese, and I also had a translation of the whole thing into German by Heinisch.
Mm-hmm.
So I sat down and I started studying this text. Mm-hmm. And that became the main activity of my academic life, because from that moment on, that book became my Bible. So I left the Bible that I'd been using before.
If there were big differences in between those translations, since you have seen in German and
yes,
in Chinese?
Yes, of course, because that is the most ancient Mongolian language that we know. The secret history was written in about 1228, 29.
29. Originally it was written in
And originally it was
Mongolian.
written in Uyghur.
Uyghur.
That was the alphabet that was adopted by the Mongols under Genghis Khan, and it was the official Mongolian script at the time. Then the original Mongol text of the secret history was unfortunately lost because of the political upheaval at the end of the dynasty.
In 50s, you came to Australia to make your PhD?
Yes.
And then also you went to Taiwan?
No, I didn't go to Taiwan.
You did not. Some materials related to Mongolians or its story was taken by Chiang Kai-shek from Beijing to Taiwan.
Yes, Chiang Kai-shek took a lot of documents also in Mongolian, but fortunately it was after my period. It was mainly Ming and Qing, the Manchu dynasty material that went from China to Taiwan.
Okay.
But all the material that I needed for my work was in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar, of course, in the National Library. It was in China, mainland China. It was in Japan. It was in Russia, and in some Western libraries. So I had access to them.
As a professor who had spent all your academic career related to Genghis Khan, Mongolian history, we have currently a certain image, picture, painting of Genghis Khan. Maybe you see all around.
Of course.
But how much you think this one is reflecting the Genghis Khan itself, and
it's an idealized.
reliable?
It is an idealized portrait.
But they say it is taken from Taiwan.
the original painting, which was a collection of a series of emperors, not only of the Mongol dynasty, but also Ming, and the wives of these emperors too. For instance, Kubilai's wife is one of the painting. They were taken because they were in the National Museum in China. They were taken to Taiwan, and they are all there now. So that portrait you're talking about is in fact in Taiwan, is in Taipei, but that doesn't apply to the books, to the text.
Okay.
That's only a painting.
Do you think the original book, which is lost in Mongolian Uyghur, letter Uyghur transcript, if they had some painting, you think, or they had not?
No,
This was just
no.
writing.
It was just a text that was written down. And in my opinion, in my latest research, I've come to the conclusion that the text, the original text of the secret history, was actually compiled by Genghis Khan's third son, Ögedei. Ögedei has a bad reputation. Usually they represent him as a bit of a drunkard, also because the portrait of Ögedei in Taiwan depicts him as a man who is addicted a lot to drinking. He had the face of a drinker. But this is very unfair, because he had the reputation of a drinker, and the painter simply used that reputation to depict him as a drinker.
Okay. So you started in the way, you are the first translation, you are the first translator of that famous book into English.
Yes, but I shared that glory with Professor Cleves of Harvard, who had translated the whole thing into English before mine, but had not published it, and for various reasons.
Which year was it?
So he completed his translation in 1957, 58. It was almost ready for the printer then. But then it was criticized by his colleagues because it was written in a biblical English, not in modern English, but in a very stilted King James Bible English. And so very difficult to read for an ordinary person. And he was upset by that and decided not to publish it. In the meantime, I started producing mine in very simple English, so that even a student, in fact it was published in a student's magazine, my first translation, could understand it. And then later he published his translation when I had already published more than half of mine, and it came out, and I completed mine, so that by the time I completed my work, there were 2 English translations, and then somebody else, a Mongol, who was living in England, Onan, translated it also into English.
Which year?
I think he translated it in about 1990.
Oh, quite late.
Yes, quite late.
So the Western English-speaking audience got 3 versions, more or less, at the same time.
Yes, and then the French got another one, and so on. And then, now, you wouldn't believe it, but there are more than 100 translations of the secret history. It's one of the most translated books at the moment, because it's extremely popular with the renewed interest that people have for Mongolia and for Genghis Khan.
Yes. And meanwhile, you started in a way Mongolian studies somehow, or at least at the University
Yes,
of
yes.
National
I
University of
started them
Australia
in
here.
Australia.
And then you start to network with other Mongol studies, right?
Yes, yes.
So please tell us about who is the most prominent figures of that Mongol studies abroad.
Well, you see, the powerhouse,
Uh-huh.
the powerhouse until 20 years ago was the United States. And unfortunately, virtually all the great Mongolists in America have died. And so that the focus has shifted. You have a good Hungarian school of Mongolia.
Mm-hmm.
You have a lot of brilliant Mongolists in Mongolia now, trained by Mongol scholars.
Uh-huh.
You have in Inner Mongolia and in China, in Beijing, you have good Mongolists. The Japanese are among the best. In Australia, the one who has specialized in this area, it's me, it's I, but I think more and more people are becoming interested here too.
How many times you have visited Mongolia yourself?
Oh, about half a dozen times.
Half a dozen times.
Yes.
And when was the first visit?
1970. That's when I met Professor Schillinger.
Okay.
Schillinger.
And tell us about him, please.
Yes, Professor Schillinger was a very fine gentleman. And he was, of course, the president of the Academy of Science. And his colleague was Professor Natzegdeutsch. And at that time, Dandin Suren and Rinchen were the greatest scholars in Mongolia. And I met all these people, and I became very friendly with them, so that I corresponded with Dandin Suren for many years until his very death, and also with Rinchen. And Professor Schillinger is concerned. There's a very funny story that I arrived in Mongolia with presents for the academy. And one was a nice leather bottle with vodka, and the other one was a nice Italian white silk scarf, because I was told that this was the hadak that you just present. But we were so busy with the conference that I kept these things until the last day. And then I made quickly an appointment with Professor Schillinger, who was really a very nice person as a human being. And he said, well, what can I do for you? I think that I know this. First of all, is that he had a little book, and he was taking notes. But he was not writing in Cyrillic, but he took the notes in Uyghur to write fast.
Uh-huh.
And I said, I'm very sorry. He says, I have a parting present for you. And he said, what's that? I said, yes, I have a bottle of vodka, and I have a scarf of Italian silk for you. And he started laughing like mad. He said, oh, this is very curious, because, you know, in Mongolia, you give these presents when you arrive, not when you So I said, I'm terribly sorry, but this has been such a great experience meeting with you that I just forgot about that, but I had still time to do it, and I presented him with that. So we left in the very, very good terms.
Now you have started Mongolian Institute at the university.
That's correct.
Yeah, and why you didn't start it earlier?
Because Mongolia was not well known in Australia, except for a few, maybe two occasions in which Mongol politicians came to Canberra for an international conference. And one of these was in the 70s, and I remember one of the members was called Punsang Norov. And actually, I went to visit these Mongols, and I told them that I was working on Mongolia. They were surprised. They said, oh, we thought that no one here would be interested. And they were a bit suspicious. They thought, you know, is it true or not? So I think Punsang Norov wanted to test me. So he took a piece of paper, and he wrote a few words in Mongolian, Uygurchen. One was Mongol, the other one was Surgal, Surgawuli, and things like this. And I could read them. I said, oh, this is wonderful. He says, you can read Mongolian. I said, come and have a drink with me. I live just opposite. So we crossed the street, and it was the evening, and it was a beautiful sky. All the stars could be seen. This was 1970. And he said, you know, today, this morning, we went to see a number of sheep farms near Canberra. And, well, to tell you the truth, our sheep in Mongolia are much better than Australian sheep. But the sky that you have here is very good. It's like our sky.
Please tell us why Australians, new generation, next generation of Australia to know more about Mongolia.
Well, you see, the prime motor in all these things is business. So Mongolia now is really in the picture because of the discoveries of mineral resources and so on, and people are becoming interested because Australia is involved in that. I think there are several hundred Australians at the moment living and working in Mongolia, and so this has revived interest in a country which had been almost virtually forgotten because of its association, former association with the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
We were on the other side, in the other camp.
Mm-hmm.
But then, after 1990, the situation changed, and my writings also, many of them were published in Australia. People started reading more about Mongolia, and then the big boom came,
Mm-hmm.
and this is what really did it. And I think that people are primarily interested in Mongolia for what it can offer as a profession, as a job for young people who cannot find other niche where to.
As a person who studied Mongolia for that many centuries, history of Mongolians, and today New Mongolia, which is being interested now by business in the
Yes.
world, what you would advise
The Mongols.
for us to think over again and again?
I think what is very important, the most important thing for the Mongols is to realize that there is, we live really in a global society. They must, first of all, be conversant with, try to do what they can to improve their language, conversant with at least two languages. The Russian is very easy for the Mongols to learn because they already have a background. English is essential. I think the first thing that I would advise young people is to become fluent in Russian and English, and then to read as much as possible about the world outside, good histories of Europe, of Asia, and about art and about literature as much as they can. So practice, practice, and practice, meaning reading and reading and reading.
And yet Russian is now, English is overtaking Russia.
Yes.
And unfortunately, less and less people speak and study Russian.
It's a pity.
That's very pity.
It's a great pity.
Please tell us about the importance of Russian and why.
Russian has a beautiful literature, the 19th century literature produced in Russian. And as I say, you're very fortunate because your cultural background before 1990 is largely affected and influenced by Russian, and all the Mongols that I met when I went to Mongolia spoke fluent Russian.
Yes.
So I say, oh, this is very good.
As I do, as many of
Beautiful.
us today.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful language.
Yes.
It's an extremely rich language. It has a wonderful literature.
Yes.
And they have produced some of the best work on Mongolia. You see, the Mongols were the first that investigated Mongolia. Mongolistics as a science was a monopoly of Russia in the 19th century. So Russia, you adopted the Cyrillic alphabet from Russia in 1941 or 42. I mean, the link is terribly important. And I say that really objectively speaking. English naturally now is overtaking other languages, but we must not forget Russian and the Russians. So English is essential, Russian is very useful, and I would recommend the study of the languages, the study of the history of the rest of the world, and then to become good and really good in one thing. So you must be a generalist in your total outlook of culture, have this basic knowledge of essential languages, and then become and work very hard to become good at one thing. It doesn't matter what it is, but possibly something that you like, because there is nothing worse in life than to be settled with something that you have to do to earn a living, but which you don't like.
Dr. Rachewiltz, this is exactly what I think the agenda of our new generation is.
I hope so.
Thank you very much
It's a
for
pleasure.
sharing your view, and which is very important for this and next generation, from the person who studied all your life our history. Thank you very much.
I thank you.
All the
Thank
success.
you. And my best
Very
wishes to all the Mongols and to all my friends in Mongolia.
Thank you.
This has been a great
Thank you.
pleasure.